I did not kill Renee and the kids, and I believe I was framed.
A Gulf War Army veteran convicted of a quadruple murder in Okaloosa County is set to be executed any moment now. Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted in 2001 for the murder of his girlfriend and her 3 children in Crestview in 1998. Hutchinson is set to be the 4th person executed in Florida this year. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Hutchinson last month.
He shot a 9-year-old boy, then a 7-year-old girl, then a 4-year-old. Then he called the police himself. He was decorated by the United States Army. He fought in one of the most dangerous theaters of the Gulf War. He went behind enemy lines. He was trained to protect. He was trusted with lives. 3 of those lives were children, ages 9, 7, and 4. He took all of them. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was born on November 6, 1962, in Alaska. He grew up in Kettle Falls, Washington, a small rural mountain town close to the Canadian border. The kind of place where people know each other's names, where children ride bikes until dark, where your neighbors show up when something goes wrong. He was one of several siblings. By most accounts, he was not a child who stood out for violence or rage. He was not a story anyone was watching. He was just a boy in a small town, growing up in America, unremarkable in the way most lives are unremarkable before they aren't. He joined the United States Army. He trained hard. He became, by the military's own standards, a skilled and reliable soldier. But Jeffrey Hutchinson was not ordinary infantry. He served in special operations. He went into places most soldiers never go. He operated in some of the most dangerous conditions the Gulf War produced. And while he was there, while he was fighting, while he was serving, while he was doing what his country asked of him, something happened to Jeffrey Hutchinson that no medal, no discharge paper, and no VA file would ever fully account for. He survived multiple blast injuries. The explosions did not kill him, but they left something behind, something invisible, something that would take years to fully surface. A slow collapse happening inside the architecture of his mind. Gulf War illness. For tens of thousands of veterans who served in that conflict, it is a diagnosis that changed everything. Neurological damage, psychological deterioration, paranoia that builds like a tide no wall can stop. A mind that begins to see threats where none exist and cannot be convinced otherwise. He came home from the war, but part of him never made it back. When Hutchinson returned to civilian life, the paranoia that had begun overseas did not fade. It deepened. He became convinced, not just suspicious, but deeply, immovably convinced, that government agents were monitoring him, that powerful forces were hunting him, that he possessed classified knowledge that dangerous people wanted buried. To those who loved him, it was frightening. To those who didn't know him, it might have looked like the bravado of a veteran who had seen too much. But the people closest to him saw it for what it was, a mind that had been damaged by war and was now consuming itself from the inside out. And into that fractured world, into the paranoia, the isolation, the quiet unraveling, walked a woman named Renee Flaherty, and 3 children who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Renee Flaherty was 32 years old. She lived in Crestview, Florida, a city in Okaloosa County, close to the military installations that define that part of the Panhandle. She had 3 children, Jeffrey, age 9, Amanda, age 7, and Logan, the youngest, just 4 years old. Renee was not a woman looking for trouble. She was a mother. She worked. She raised her children. She did what millions of single mothers across this country do every day, carried the weight of everything, and kept moving forward anyway. At some point, Renee began a relationship with Jeffrey Hutchinson. He moved into her home. To neighbors, to onlookers, it may have looked like a family taking shape. A veteran, a mother, 3 kids, a house in Florida, an ordinary life assembling itself. But inside that house, Hutchinson's deterioration was accelerating. The paranoia had not faded with time and stability. It had deepened. The delusions had not quieted with closeness and routine. They had grown louder, and the man Renee Flaherty had allowed into her home, into her children's lives, was no longer entirely the man he may have appeared to be. Nobody outside those walls knew how bad it had gotten. Nobody is looking for them. That phrase, quiet and terrible in equal measure, would later haunt this case, because on the night everything came apart, Those 4 people were inside that house, a mother and her 3 children, and the world outside had no idea what was happening. It was September 11th, 1998. 3 years before that date would take on a different kind of grief for the entire country. On this night in Crestview, Florida, it was just a Thursday. What happened inside that house remains, in certain details, contested. What is not contested is what investigators found when they arrived. Renee Flaherty was dead, shot. She was 32 years old. Jeffrey was dead. He was 9 years old. Amanda was dead. She was 7 years old. Logan was dead. He was 4 years old. A mother and her 3 children, all shot, all inside the home they shared with Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson. Hutchinson himself called the police. He was at the scene. He claimed home invaders had broken in and committed the murders. He said he had survived. He said unknown men had done this. He gave descriptions. He answered questions. Investigators were skeptical from the start. The physical evidence told a different story. The blood spatter, the positions of the bodies, the trajectory of the shots, the lack of any credible evidence of forced entry by unknown perpetrators, the details that simply did not line up with the account of a man who claimed to have watched strangers commit 4 murders in his own home. Everything pointed inward, toward the man already inside the house. Jeffrey Hutchinson was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, the worst homicide Okaloosa County had ever seen. Counselors were dispatched to Antioch Elementary School, where Jeffrey and Amanda had been students, when classes resumed. Teachers did not know how to explain to their students why 2 of their classmates would never come back, because there is no language for that. There is no right way to tell a child that another child is gone because of something that should never happen. The community was shattered, and it would remain that way for a long time. When Jeffrey Hutchinson went to trial, his defense rested on 2 pillars: alcohol intoxication and mental illness. His attorneys argued that he could not be held fully responsible for his actions, that his mind, damaged by war, fractured by Gulf War illness, eroded by years of paranoia and neurological deterioration, had been incapable of the deliberate, calculated intent required for first-degree murder. It was not an unreasonable argument. Experts testified about his exposure to sarin gas, about blast injuries, about the documented psychological deterioration, about Gulf War illness and its measurable long-term effects on the human brain. But the jury was looking at 4 bodies, a mother, 3 children. The youngest was 4 years old. They found Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson guilty on all counts. He received 3 death sentences, 1 for each of the children. For the murder of Renee Flaherty, he received a life sentence. For nearly 3 decades, Hutchinson sat on Florida's death row. He maintained, consistently, adamantly, without a single wavering, that he did not do it. He insisted to every attorney, every investigator, every person who would listen, that government agents had entered that house, that he had been framed, that the murders were committed to silence him, to suppress what he knew about Gulf War veterans and classified government operations. Most people, prosecutors, investigators, the victim's family, heard those claims and recognized them for what they were: the fixed, immovable delusions of a severely mentally ill man. But some people heard something else. They heard a veteran, a man whose mind had been fractured by the same government that was now preparing to execute him, and they asked a question that would follow this case all the way to its end. Does it matter how a mind was broken, if the breaking was real? This is where the Jeffrey Hutchinson case becomes something more than a story about a crime. It becomes a story about a system, about how the machinery of justice, which is supposed to be precise, procedural, fair, can fail in ways that are so mundane, so administrative, so quiet that nobody outside a courtroom ever hears about them. Under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, known as AEDPA, death row inmates have 1 year from the time their sentences become final to file a habeas appeal in federal court. And that clock can be paused while state appeals are still being processed. The math is supposed to be straightforward. In practice, these calculations become extraordinarily complex. Competing interpretations of the law, overlapping timelines, judges and attorneys disagreeing about exactly when the clock stopped and when it started again. In Jeffrey Hutchinson's case, his attorneys made a miscalculation. They filed his federal habeas appeal late. The court dismissed it. Not because the appeal had no merit, not because his claims were frivolous, Not because a judge reviewed the substance of his constitutional arguments and found them wanting. Because of a deadline. No federal court ever reviewed the substance of Jeffrey Hutchinson's claims about his war-induced brain damage. No federal court ever examined whether his mental illness meant his trial was constitutionally compromised. No federal court ever weighed whether a man with documented neurological damage from nerve gas exposure should be executed by the country that sent him into that gas, because his attorney miscalculated a date. The Death Penalty Information Center reviewed 57 capital cases where federal appeals were dismissed, not on their merits, but because of missed deadlines. 57. And counting. The argument from the legal system is one of finality. Rules exist for a reason. Deadlines are deadlines. The process must have an endpoint. The argument from Hutchinson's advocates was different. You are about to execute a man whose case a federal court has never fully heard. Both of those arguments are legally coherent. That is exactly what makes this so difficult to look at directly. On April 30, 2025, one day before the scheduled execution, a letter arrived at the office of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. It was signed by 129 military veterans. These were not activists looking for a cause. These were people who had worn the same uniform Jeffrey Hutchinson had worn, people who had deployed to the same region, people who had breathed the same air, absorbed the same blast waves, and come home carrying what that war leaves behind. Their argument was not about innocence. They were not claiming Hutchinson was framed, or that a jury had been misled. Their argument was something more precise and more devastating. Jeffrey Hutchinson's mind was a casualty of war. Just like any limb lost on a battlefield, just like any life lost in combat, his psychological destruction was not a moral failing. It was a wound inflicted during service, a wound the government had never fully addressed. And now that same government was about to execute him for what that wound had left behind. They asked the governor to stop the execution. DeSantis did not respond. Maria Deliberato, executive director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and liaison for Hutchinson's legal team, was honest and precise in how she framed her advocacy. She agreed openly and explicitly that Hutchinson was guilty of murdering the Flahertys. She was not arguing innocence. She was arguing something more complicated. That Hutchinson's 30-year insistence that home invaders committed the crime, that government forces had framed him, was not the calculated lie of a man trying to escape accountability. It was the fixed, stable, decades-long delusion of a man whose mind had collapsed under the weight of untreated, war-induced mental illness. That he could not rationally understand why he was being executed. That the justifications he had built around his guilt were not strategic, they were symptoms. And if that was true, if a man genuinely does not comprehend why the state is putting him to death, then his execution raises a constitutional question American courts have circled for decades without fully answering. Can you execute a man who does not know he is being executed for what he actually did? In the final days before May 1st, Hutchinson's legal team mounted one last fight. They filed a motion in Bradford County Circuit Court, arguing that their client was mentally incompetent to be executed. This is a specific and narrow legal test. It asks one question. Does the condemned person have a rational understanding of what is happening to them and why? Defense experts testified that Hutchinson failed that test. They described a delusional disorder that had been present, consistent, and unbroken for decades. The belief that government operatives committed the Flaherty murders, the belief that his execution was a silencing operation, the belief that he was an innocent man being eliminated to protect powerful interests. These were not shifting stories. They were not the changing accounts of a man improvising a defense. They were the same fixed narrative, repeated in the same way, to the same people, over 30 years. Multiple people who had worked with Hutchinson across those decades, mitigation specialists, prior investigators, former attorneys, testified that his delusions were firm and long-standing, that they had never wavered, that the man they knew in 2025 believed the same things he had believed in 1999. State experts disagreed. They testified that Hutchinson was sane and competent. After more than 10 hours of expert testimony, Judge James M. Kolaw ruled Jeffrey Hutchinson was sane and competent to be executed. His attorneys continued filing. The Florida Supreme Court dismissed on April 21st. A second appeal, dismissed April 25th. The 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed that same week. Every motion, every appeal, every door tried, every single one of them closed. In the weeks before the execution, Wesley Elmore spoke out. He was Renee Flaherty's brother, the uncle of Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan. He had no doubt. He had never had any doubt. Not after the verdict, not after the appeals. Not after 30 years of Hutchinson maintaining his innocence from a Florida death row cell. Wesley Elmore flew from Washington to Florida to witness the execution. He did not attend out of vengeance. He attended because for 27 years he had been carrying 4 deaths. A sister he would never speak to again. A nephew who never became a man. A niece who never had a prom night, a college letter, a first apartment. A 4-year-old boy who never got to find out who he was going to be. And he deserved, as much as any human being can deserve anything, in a situation this irreparably broken, to see it end. Hutchinson's own family maintained his innocence until the end. His niece and brother pointed to a phone call made the night of the murders, a caller with a slight southern accent that they claimed did not belong to Hutchinson. They noted the murder weapon had been broken and yielded no direct DNA connection. They said the trial had not been fair. Courts had heard these arguments, multiple courts, multiple times. They had not found them sufficient. This is the part of these cases that never resolves cleanly. 2 families on opposite sides of something that cannot be undone, one asking for justice, one asking for mercy, and a system that must eventually choose, and then move on in the way systems do, because systems don't carry grief the way people do. The people do. On April 1st, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Jeffrey Hutchinson's death warrant. The execution was set for May 1st, 2025. 30 days. In those 30 days, every available legal mechanism was used, every appeal filed, every court approached, and one by one, every door closed. On the night of May 1st, 2025, Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was brought to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was 62 years old. His last meal, salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, iced tea. He had no last words. At 8:15 in the evening, Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was pronounced dead. He was the 15th person executed in the United States in 2025. He was the 4th person executed on Florida's death row that year. He was not the last. Wesley Elmore was in that room. Hutchinson's niece and brother were not. 4 people died in that house in 1998. 1 more died in a Florida prison in 2025. Jeffrey Hutchinson's case does not resolve cleanly. There is no version of this story where everyone walks away satisfied, where the scales feel even, where the right answer is obvious. If you look at this case only through the lens of the crime, 4 people shot dead in their own home, a mother and her 3 children, the worst homicide Okaloosa County had ever recorded. The execution looks like justice. A jury found him guilty. Decades of appeals exhausted every available legal channel. Courts reviewed the claims and ruled against them. The sentence was carried out. A legitimate one. But if you expand the frame, if you include the sarin gas, the blast injuries, the documented Gulf War illness, the decades of fixed delusional disorder, the federal appeal dismissed on a procedural technicality rather than its merits, the 129 veterans who wrote a letter that received no reply, then what you are looking at becomes more complicated. You are looking at a man the U.S. military deployed into one of the most dangerous chemical weapon environments of the modern era. A man who came back with invisible damage. Damage that was documented, damage that was real, damage that no VA clinic, no discharge process, no support system adequately addressed. A man who, whatever happened in that house in 1998, had been substantially broken by the country that was now executing him. That does not erase 4 deaths. It does not restore Renee Flaherty. It does not give Jeffrey and Amanda their adult lives back. It does not give Logan a 5th birthday, or a first day of school, or any of the 10,000 ordinary moments he was owed. Nothing does that. Nothing ever will. But the question that veterans advocates and death penalty critics raised in this case is not about erasing those deaths. It is about something more systemic. It is about whether our justice system is genuinely equipped to handle the cases of people whose capacity for rational thought was destroyed by service to the state before the crime was ever committed. It is about whether a man who may have never had a rational understanding of his own guilt can meaningfully be executed for it. It is about asking who bears responsibility when war follows a soldier home and what it leaves behind when it arrives. The Death Penalty Information Center has documented 57 cases where federal habeas appeals were dismissed not on their merits, but because an attorney missed a filing deadline. 57. And counting. Jeffrey Hutchinson is one name on that list. He will not be the last. Crestview, Florida is a quiet city. It has always been a military community. The bases nearby mean it has always sent people to war and received some of them back. What it is less prepared for, what most communities are less prepared for, is what to do with the ones who come home changed. The ones who come back with damage that doesn't show on an X-ray. The ones who build lives and relationships and families, and then one night become something that nobody who loved them ever saw coming. That is not an excuse. It is a question, and we keep refusing to answer it. Nobody is looking for them. Renee Flaherty's brother flew from Washington to Florida to make sure that was not true. 4 people died in that house on September 11, 1998. One man carried the weight of it for 27 years through every appeal, every motion, every court that ruled against him, carrying within himself either a fixed delusion or an elaborate lie, and we may never know with certainty which it was. That is the part of this case that does not close. Renee, Jeffrey, Amanda, Logan. And on May 1st, 2025, at 8:15 in the evening, the last chapter of this story was written. These cases don't end when the execution does. The questions this story forces us to sit with, about veterans' mental health, about legal deadlines that quietly end lives, about what justice looks like when the system itself may have failed. Those questions are still open right now, in other courtrooms, about other people, in other states. If this story made you think, if it left you with something unresolved you cannot quite name, that is exactly what this channel was built for. If you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Dark Case File True Crime right now. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell. Do not miss what comes next. Every case we cover completely. No shortcuts, no sensationalism, just the full story, the facts, the context, and the questions that need to be asked even when nobody wants to sit with them. If this video moved you, like it, share it. The more people who watch, the more stories we can tell, and the more voices we can give to the cases that got buried under paperwork and procedure and silence. Like, subscribe, share. Dark Case File True Crime.